In lesson 25, we talked about caching using the output cache attribute. This particular feature of caching is actually implemented as something called a filter in the MVC framework. And a filter is simply code that runs prior to or after the execution of an action method. So there are built-in filters that we're going to look at. There are also custom filters that you create that allow you to perform, again, any logic before or after the execution of an action result method. So as I said, there are built-in filters. There are actually four. We already know the first one, the output cache attribute. Obviously that's going to provide output caching, and we already looked at that one. Then there's something called the authorize attribute, which does what it says. You know, when you think about authorization, you're thinking about security, adding a layer of security, maybe checking the user's permissions in the system. So that authorize attribute will restrict access by authentication and optionally by authentication as well. And there's actually a second attribute that kind of goes along with that filter called allow anonymous, and that is kind of the corollary to it. It works as an exemption to the rule. So if you have some sort of security based on your entire controller, you can say, except for this action result method, don't apply that rule to it. There's also a require HTTPS attribute, and so this one, again, it does what it sounds like. It will force any requests that are coming through to a given action through unsecured HTTP, and it will say, hey, you can't do that. This particular action requires an SSL certificate to be employed. So try again using HTTPS. All right, and then the final built-in filter is called handle error attribute, and it will specify how to handle an exception that's thrown by the action result method. So by default, whenever a action method with handle error attribute throws any exception, then the MVC framework will throw a page called error.cshtml. It'll display that to the end user, and it's much more friendly error message than just, you know, kind of those error messages we've been seeing on our that are default to ASP.NET. So I have a quick example that'll just demonstrate this, the handle error attribute example. And you can see that here in the action result index method, I've applied the handle error attribute, and I'm intentionally throwing a new exception, just filling in a little bit of text there. Now, by employing this filter, it's going to look in the views shared error.cshtml page, and it will display that to the end user. Now in this particular case, I'm not displaying anything except the word error, but you can use Razor syntax to modify any of the messaging that you want to inside of here. The only other thing that you need to do is to go to the web config, and you got to make sure that you have this particular custom errors entry in the configuration system.web section. So custom errors mode equal on, default redirect equals error. All right, so let's go and run the application, and we'll see it at work. Now the first thing that we see is that Visual Studio gets in the way, and it says, hey, there's an exception that's unhandled. In this case, yeah, that's exactly what we wanted. So I'm just going to click the continue button, and then we'll see our friendly error page. All right, so this is a great example of a filter because we didn't do anything special in order to get this functionality. All we did was just apply that attribute to this method, and we get all of this additional functionality of handling errors. The same thing with caching. All we had to do is just add an attribute, and we get all this additional functionality that we didn't have to write into each and every action result method or make a call from there into a method that did all of this. Okay. Now, like I said earlier, there are the built-in filters, but you can also create your own custom filters by plugging in at specific points in the life cycle of an MVC framework runtime page request. And to really understand filters, we have to go back to that PDF that we looked at earlier. You'll recall this one, the application lifecycle, with that big diagram with lots of boxes and lots of small text here. And if you don't already have it, take a look at that page. You can download it from www.asp.net/mvc/overview and it will just take you there. That little shortcut will. Okay, so let's get back here, and if you look, and I'm going to have to zoom in here so you can see what I'm talking about. Give me the hand here. Okay, great. All right, so now you're going to see that at this specific point in time, and there's already some pipeline activity going on. Here we're identifying the controller so that the request gets routed to a controller, and we've identified the specific action result method. Now before we execute that action result method, the first thing we're going to do is invoke an authentication filter, all right, just like we talked about. Now, again, you already have the authentication attribute, but these are custom. You can add in your own custom authentication filters right here by creating a class that implements the authentication filter method. And you can see that it actually, this top one is an opportunity to invoke authentication filters, and then below it you can invoke authorization filters. So not only are you who you say you are, but then also what rights you have in the system to perform anything. So you can take out and say only admins can perform these actions, whereas any user can perform these other actions over here. Okay, and you don't have to write that logic into each and every page. You can just apply these filters as attributes on the top of each of them, and it will take care of that. Going further into this, you can see that there is something called the action filter. So this will be performed before and after the action result method is about to execute and has executed. And then finally there is an result filter, which again, this will be executed as the result. So when the view is being populated and getting ready to be executed and sent back to the user, you can plug in by implementing a class that implements the result filter interface. And there's also, and I don't see it here, but then there's also the ability to plug in for exceptions as well, and I'm not sure where that's at, but it's somewhere here on this PDF. So you just have to understand that when you are creating your own custom filter, you're plugging in at very specific points that the creators of the MVC framework allowed for. So they're looking for any classes that implement these specific filter interfaces, and will execute those prior to and then after the execution of the action result method. Okay. Now to illustrate this a little bit better, I have a project called Filter Example, and you should have access to this. And so just to kind of recap what we said, there are specific points in time where filters are employed. So we saw in that diagram that there were 4 types of filters, each one corresponding to a specific point in the life cycle of a request. So we saw that there were authorization filters, there were action filters, result filters, and exception filters. These are all the places where you can plug in. Now you may never need any more than the default authorize attribute to take care of most of your authorization and authentication needs. But if you do, you can ignore that attribute. You can override the appropriate method that corresponds to the authorization filter and create your own. And I just want to also say one thing about authorization, authentication. These are, there's actually kind of a larger story about these topics, as well as membership in ASP.NET MVC, and we're going to devote an entire mini-series to that topic in the future. But what I said for authorization filters is true for exception filters as well. You may never need anything except for the default handle error attribute that we looked at in that little project just a moment ago to take care of most of your exception handling needs. But if you ever need additional functionality, if you ever need to plug in and take control of that process, then you can ignore that attribute. You can override the appropriate methods that correspond to the exception filter by implementing a class that implements exception filter, and you essentially create your own exception filter. Now, the action and result filters allow you to modify something about the request or something about the response. And again, the examples are things like the built-in filters, require HTTPS attribute, which acts as kind of a gatekeeper to prevent unencrypted requests. Also, the output cached attribute caches the response. So you see one that happens before the action result method is executed and one that happens after the result is created. So these filters are great for pre-processing and post-processing the action result method and the view execution across your entire site. You typically refer to those types of functionality as cross-cutting. So you may have a cross-cutting concern like exception handling and logging and maybe profiling your application. So those are cross-cutting in nature. It would be cumbersome to implement something like logging or something like authentication in every single action result method. So what you do is you implement it in one class and then you apply attributes or you can maybe plug in at specific points in the pipeline and then it will apply to every request and for that particular cross-cutting concern. So you can basically address any cross-cutting concern in one place, and then each request or each result is filtered, thus the name filter. It's filtered through that code. So I mentioned some possible uses already, but they include profiling and logging, saving session data for a given user long term. So instead of just 20 minutes of session data, you can actually store it long term and keep somebody's shopping cart items in their shopping cart. A year later, they come back and the items are still in the shopping cart. Filtering certain data based on the user's privileges in the system. That might be another good usage. Now, how do you implement a custom filter? It's actually really easy. You'll see that there's a little pattern. You just follow the pattern and you've got yourself a new filter. So if you take a look at this, you basically start by creating a filter class, and you got to make sure to derive from the filter attribute base class, and then you either also implement iActionFilter or iResultFilter based on what you're trying to accomplish, right? And then you right-click on this and you select Implement Interface. Unfortunately, it went off the screen, and that will create the little stubs for the methods that you need to override. So in this case, we're overriding onActionExecuted and onActionExecuting. This first one happens right before the action is executed. This onActionExecuted happens right after the action result method is fired off. And so you can see we're going to display some data to the user here in just a moment. You can see that I have another filter that I've created. Again, I am inheriting from the filter attribute base class, but then I'm also implementing the iResult filter. So this is going to happen whenever we're creating the view, creating the response back through to output back to the user. Again, I right-clicked and I said, hey, implement the interface explicitly, and it created stubs for executing, which happens right before the execution, and then onResultExecuted, which happened right after the execution. Okay. So once you've created your filter classes like I've done here, then what you want to do is, and after I've actually implemented something on the whatever, executed or executing, then you want to add in your app start folder a filter config. And so this might look somewhat like a route config, right? Except you're just going to configure the filters. And here I'm just adding to this global filter collection, adding my new custom action filter and custom result filter that we just looked at here in this mycustomfilter.cs class. And then the last thing that you need to do is go to the global.asax file, and just like you would register routes, you need to register global filters. So here we go, filterconfig.register global filters, passing in global filters.filters, and that will call our filter config register global filters method, which then adds the various filters like we looked at already. Okay, so let's take a look at what these things actually do. So this this first filter I'm calling an action filter, and this is going to happen on the request. And so I'm going to say, hey, for the when this comes in, I'm going to write something to the response stream. I'm going to write Bob was all up in your action, on action executed, and then I'm doing the same thing here. I'm just grabbing out the information from the HTTP context, and the filter context is being passed in. I'm just getting off information from that through the HTTP context and just printing out the name of the user, the address where they're accessing it from, the UTC, date time, and then also the raw URL that was requested, and just putting those out in a result and printing them out. Okay. Then I'm doing something similar in the result filter, just printing out on result executed, on result executing. So if we run the application, you can see at what point these start showing up in our application. So you can see, first of all, the first thing that executes is the on action executing, and it prints out the IP address, the date time, and the URL that was requested, just / for the root. Then it executed the on action executed method of the action result filter. And then here you can see, before we actually execute the view, on result executing gets fired, then the view gets created, and then finally the on result executed gets fired. And so here we go. We were able to plug into the pipeline, the MVC framework lifecycle at specific points in order to add our own code, our cross-cutting concerns for our application. Now in this particular case, I didn't implement these as attributes. Instead, they're going to run every single time. If I wanted to add, only use them judiciously on certain action result methods, then I would need to implement them as attributes, and that's a little bit more advanced, and I'm not going to demonstrate that, but there are code examples online, so you can search for that, implementing filters as attributes. All right, so again, to recap, filters are an elegant way of implementing cross-cutting concerns, code that we want executed on every request and every response. And we saw how they're used by the MVC framework to create some built-in filters to implement several important features for security, exception handling, and things of that nature. And so you should not shy away from using them too if you need them. All right, so that's it for filters. See you in the next lesson. Thanks.